talking with Nick Nicholson. He's an art historian who actually provided some of the research and some of the information and consulted on a beautiful new book out by the St. John the Baptist Monastery at Mesopotamos in Cyprus. It's Mesopotamos Publications, and the title is The Romanov Royal Martyrs, What Silence Could Not Conceal. So was the information coming out before the archives were opened, is it like tainted by a Soviet perspective? Is that why it was misinformation? Was that intentional in order to create a mythology about the birth of the Soviet Empire or the Soviet Union?
No, I would not say that. Largely because, not entirely, largely because there was almost no information available about Nicholas II and his family in the Soviet Union. They did not fit into the Soviet understanding of history in any way, except that they were a failed ruler and the end of a decadent foreign dynasty who had done nothing but harm to the Russian people, period, So sure, 1905 was of interest to the Soviets because it was the first time the workers rose up. That was the sort of basic story. And the arc of that story is that what began in 1905 was finished in 1917. But that's not really true. All stories are much more complicated. They're rounder and they have more depth than we're accustomed to. And all of these new documents just add layers and layers of understanding to a very important historical moment. So there are many documents in this book that are quoted in this book from the Russian archives that were found by a man called Dr. Pyotr Multatuli, who is a renowned Russian author and journalist and historian. He's a professor at the Moscow State Institute for Culture and Arts, and he's devoted almost his entire career to research and writing about the distorted truths in relation to the reign of Nicholas II. And his contributions of documents for this work were very significant, very significant.
And of course, Nick, we're talking about how there used to be sort of a different narrative understood about the Romanov family, but since the 90s and since the opening of the archives in Moscow, there's so much more information now for people to access and for historians and everyone else that as we really flesh out the story, we see that it's very different from some of the assumptions and some of the way that the story has been told.
One of the things that, of course, happened with the changes in the politics in Russia in the early 90s is that the archives became available to scholars, both Russians and foreigners. And a lot of the new documents that are used in this book are a result of that openness.
And of course, this book goes through with all sorts of wonderful citations and, letters that they wrote to each other and to friends and diaries and memoirs. And it's just, it's really beautiful. It's very personal and it involves a lot of direct sources, right? You're not hearing about them, you're really reading them yourself, and they're quite lovely. So we just talked a little bit about 1905. There was a revolution in 1905 that was sort of considered like the beginnings of the unrest that would become the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And it's so different from the way that it was told. Now, is everything different the way that it was told from the way that it was told before? Like, for instance, the intervening years there between 1905 and 1917, are they understood differently now or imagined differently now that we've seen these new sources and this new information?
Well, political observations aside, I think that the story of the family and the raising of the children is seen quite differently. back when the earliest versions were written of the lives of the family, there were people who were close to the imperial family who talked about the Grand Duchesses, for example, the four daughters of Nicholas II and Alexandra, and they remarked sort of in passing on their personality, and it led to sort of a thought that these girls were interchangeable, not very well educated, that they didn't see much of the outside world. But this book gathered together an enormous amount of research on the lives of the young women and also their brother, the heir. Dr. Helen Rappaport, who's an acclaimed author and historian and Russianist, has written many books on the Romanovs, and she was a consultant. And my colleague, Helen Azar, with whom I was honored to co-author a translation of the diaries of Grand Duchess Tatiana. Helen has done full translations of the diaries of Grand Duchess Olga, Tatiana, and now with George Hawkins has done Grand Duchess Maria. She's going to be doing the diaries of Grand Duchess Anastasia next. Now that the girls can speak for themselves, we have a very different picture, and those diaries and letters were incorporated into this book. So we have a far richer understanding of these young women and their talents and their abilities and their thoughts about duty and their position within the greater imperial family, and the work that they did, most particularly during the First World War, when they became nurses and worked in hospitals and came into contact with everyday Russians who were wounded and incredibly sick. There are descriptions of Grand Duchess Tatiana performing the most unspeakable surgeries without even blinking at the age of 17. The Empress was noted for her extraordinary compassion and her abilities in the operating room, as was Tatiana. Grand Duchess Olga was a little more sensitive and didn't do as well in the theater of war, but she was helpful on an administrative level. And even the youngest girls, Maria and Anastasia, had a lazaret, an infirmary where they went and visited with soldiers who were sick, and they really paid attention to who was going through and where they came from. The girls are described as being endlessly interested in other people and very engaged and interested about where they came from, what they did, how long they had traveled. They were really interesting lives cut short. It's very sad, but we get a real sense of them in this book, and we haven't before.
Absolutely. That's true. They've just sort of been the four sisters, right? Like, oh, they're all just a bunch of sheltered, sweet little girls, whatever. And here you really begin to understand each of their personalities. And I thought it was so interesting and really lovely the way that they were raised. They were accustomed to doing work. Like, they were accustomed to getting involved. They're like cutting wood, they're right. Kind of amazing, really neat, down-to-earth Christian young women, and they are active and involved and doing things. Talk a little bit more about maybe their personalities and I guess how they were raised. Yeah, that's so unusual, I would imagine, for princesses to have these experiences, and they're so different, I think, from other royal families.
Well, it's true. And again, our ideas of what constitutes a royal family really come from the West. We look at England and we look at the German royal families because there were so many German princesses. And largely, princesses in the West were raised almost to have no religion because they never knew who they were going to marry and what faith they were going to have to adopt. They were raised in a kind of neutral way so that they would fit into whatever country they moved to. And that was never the case for Russian Grand Duchesses and even for the daughters of the Russian Tsars before they became emperors. They were bound to orthodoxy. They were raised Orthodox. They were, part of their dowry was that they would never give up orthodoxy and that they would build churches wherever they moved. So this was an intrinsic part of their lives. And to Western scholars, I think they find the religious observances of the Empress and the Emperor and their children excessive. But for those of us who are Orthodox, there's nothing excessive about it at all. It's just they weren't fanatics. They were just models. They went every morning for morning prayers. They went for every evening. They had evening prayers. They confessed regularly, but far less than we do today. They confessed at the beginning of the feasts and at beginning of the fasts, and then of course at all the feasts. And they regarded confession with enormous reverence, perhaps because it didn't happen so frequently. And they really lived a fully Christian life by example. They had wonderful examples in their parents and in their close relatives and in the friends that they formed from the Russian noble families who had greatest access to the imperial family at court, all of whom were raised the same way. I have to say they had a gentle faith that was not oppressive in any way. And I remember vividly, many years ago in my own experience, a woman from a Russian noble family saying to me, you're so interested in the Romanovs, but you'll never understand them until you're Orthodox. And she was right. It's many of the things they do that Western historians say, I just can't understand why they did that, make perfect sense when you understand they had a complete acceptance of God's will for them. And they didn't argue. They didn't fight. There was no self-will. They were really in God's hands all the time and felt so. And other people felt it as well.
It really is remarkable. And I have to say, I remember, I didn't know a lot about them. I wasn't raised Orthodox. I converted. And when they were first canonized, I asked someone about it, and they were like, it's because they're martyrs. I don't think they were really very holy. And I'm so pleasantly surprised to see this amazing, faithful, beautiful life going on with this family. And as you mentioned, Alexandra, the mother, she converted from, was it Lutheranism?
She was a Lutheran.
Yeah,
she was a Lutheran. Yeah.
Right, because of Germany. She was a Lutheran, and she was really sincere about her faith. So when she converted to Orthodoxy, that was like a gut-wrenching and very serious spiritual change. And of course, Nicholas had always been a very faithful person. And they are really a beautiful, beautiful, faithful family. And I want to say we have a phone call. We have someone calling in with a question for you, Nick.
Sure.
Tim in Ohio. Tim, are you there?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so very much. I think this is just a fascinating program. I can't see how you're going to be able to cover even 1/10 of it in the hour.
Tell me about it, Tim.
There's no way. This book is amazing.
The questions I have are not going to help you at it either. I feel
like we should have an episode for every chapter, honestly. But all right, Tim, let's hear them.
In the West, you kind of touched on this in a couple of points that you made. I mean, in the West, we kind of think of the royal family more or less, the English kind of like thing, and they don't really have that much power. And but then you described a number of things that Nicholas actually did. Can you kind of give just a thumbnail sketch of how much power he had and whether there was anything similar to a House of Lords and that type of thing that had any power at all?
Well, it depends on what time in his reign you're speaking about, because when he inherited the throne, he inherited absolute power. Russia was one of the last real autocracies. I think even now, only Saudi Arabia comes close. The emperor had absolute sway over everything, and all law came from the emperor. So he had absolute power and was raised to be an absolute monarch. And while his grandfather, Alexander II, had been quite liberal and had instigated many kinds of liberal reforms, his father, Alexander III, was more reactionary and had done everything he could to maintain peace and order during his reign, even if it seemed a little oppressive or greatly oppressive to many Russian subjects. Nicholas inherited this momentous and difficult type of power, and it was in 1905 that Russia became a constitutional monarchy, and they erected the Duma, which was a representative form of government. There was an imperial senate where the senators were appointed by the emperor, but then there was also the State Duma, which was full of elected officials from various social classes. And it is no country can go from an autocratic monarchy to a fully functioning constitutional monarchy just because someone says that it is so. And Russia did not have the opportunity to slowly develop into the kind of constitutional monarchy that we understand today, as it is known in Britain or Spain or Denmark or Norway or Sweden or Belgium or Luxembourg or any of the other monarchies that exist today. Everything they did was new ground and an argument. And Dominic Levin, who is a brilliant scholar, says, that Nicholas II was not an idiot. No one could have presided over the type of change that he was expected to preside over with any degree of success. It was too much change, too fast, in a moment when the world was hurtling towards a world war. I hope that answers your question.
It does, and I think you did it brilliantly in a very short number of minutes.